and turn it over to Bruce. It's all yours, sir.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone's doing well. I just want to take a point of personal privilege. I'm a poll worker, and so I was at my voting place at 5 o'clock this morning, and we were there from 6 to 6. So it was a good day. We had about 20% turnout, which is not what it should be, but I'm happy to be home and happy to be with you all today. And I am going to share my screen and talk about the next episode of our experience, what I am calling episode 3 of the history of Christianity. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Great. And what I would like to talk about this evening is the development of what I think are two remarkably important institutions within Christianity. And those two institutions are the papacy and monasticism. And so when we talk about these two institutions, the papacy and monasticism, we have to remember, as we talked about last week, that essentially beginning in the early 300s, that the Roman Empire is in the process of splitting. It's splitting into a solid structured empire in the East, what we will later call the Byzantine Empire. And next week, we're going to talk about the version of Christianity, the Orthodox Church that comes out of that part of the world. In the West, we see what had been the Western Roman Empire. We see that in a way change, and I don't want to say decline, it does change into a series of Germanic kingdoms. Nonetheless, it is in the West and in the city of Rome that we see the seat of power of Christianity. So it's important to keep in the background, keep on the back burner, a slowly simmering pot that reminds us that in the roughly 200-year period I'm going to talk about tonight, that Rome is splitting. And in the West, ideas, self-understandings begin to coalesce. And they coalesce around this word that all of us are familiar with. And this is the word Catholic or Catholicism. And this is the Latin, this is a word that comes out of the Latin, comes out of the Greek and the Latin, and it means universal. So when we talk about the Catholic Church, we are saying the universal church. That's the church's claim to legitimacy, that it is the universal church. Now, we talked already last week how this church, after the Edict of Milan, was becoming ever increasingly aligned with the imperial government, how it was becoming more hierarchically organized. And this hierarchical organization began to coalesce around the Bishop of Rome. And it is out of this coalescence of authority and power around the Bishop of Rome that we get the idea of the papacy. And you can see here, this is an easy word for us to pick apart etymologically. It is daddy, it's papa. So this idea has its roots in Scripture. These bishops understand themselves as being given the spiritual responsibility of go forth and teach. That's what the bishops were required to do. And as Christianity began to grow numerically, as Christianity began to grow organizationally, as Christianity began to spread geographically, by necessity, the institution found itself creating on the fly a kind of pliable organizational structure. And so just as you had deacons and elders in individual Christian house communities, and just as you then began to have episcopoi, bishops, who linked these individual house communities together into geographic areas that would be called a diocese, so it grew over time that among the bishops, although there was equality, the greatest of the equal was the Bishop of Rome. And the reason that the Bishop of Rome began to hold this place of honor and of primacy and of authority is because of the idea that Peter was the first Bishop of Rome, and that all Christians were familiar with the idea, which was present in more than one gospel, that Jesus had named Peter as the rock. In fact, Peter's name wasn't Peter, it was Simon, right? But he is given the name Peter, Petrus, right? It's where we get our word petrify, to turn something into a rock. So really, if you want to, and this is not an inaccurate statement by any stretch of the imagination, if Jesus were alive today and he were talking to Peter, Peter would be called Rocky. I mean, that's really what we see here, is that Peter is given this nickname of stability, of power, of authority. The scripture says that Jesus gives him the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever is bound on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever is loosed on earth is loosed in heaven, and Peter is the rock upon which Jesus will build his church. And so it makes perfect sense then to early Christians that if Peter is the leader of the Christian community in Rome, that the successor of Peter, the next Bishop of Rome, will inherit that power from Peter. And this is the idea of apostolic succession. Now, I know in 21st century America, this word apostolic is kind of a landmine. It means all sorts of different things to different members of Christian communities. It means something different in the Caucasian Christian community than it does in the African American Christian community. It means something different in the Catholic Christian community than it does in a Holiness Christian community. So it's a word that has all kinds of interpretations, but in the Catholic interpretation, it is the handing down of this authority, of this power, of this primacy from Peter to his successors as the Bishop of Rome. Now, I had a remarkable experience this Christmas. At Christmas, my son and I took a trip to Rome. We were going to meet my wife for a Viking River cruise, and we met up with her later in Switzerland. But before we met up with her, we went to Rome, and we knew early enough in our trip that we were going to go that we had booked a tour at the Vatican called the Scavi. And what we got to see is something that very few folks get to see. You can get the tickets, you just have to know several months in advance. We took a tour underneath St. Peter's Basilica, underneath the crypt where the popes are buried. And what we saw down there was this right here. We saw this image that I am showing you here. You see it, this is a hole in the wall, and you see here these carvings. And what you're seeing in here is, and this is another shot of it right here. What you're seeing in here is this. And these are human bones that were unearthed back in the 1970s. This was the structure that originally sat on the top of Vatican Hill, and the modern day St. Peter's Basilica is built over this. And what we were looking at just now is down below here. And when these bones were exhumed, they were found to be wrapped in purple cloth with gold thread. They were found to be the bones of a man between the ages of 50 and 70 who worked very hard. And so tradition said that this was the burial place of St. Peter. And so nobody knows for certain, but essentially what I had the opportunity to do was to stand right here where this photograph was taken and look at the bones of St. Peter, which was a remarkable experience. And so the church believes that St. Peter is the first bishop of Rome, and that he passed on from Jesus the power that was given to him from Jesus to his successors as Bishop of Rome. And this is known as apostolic succession. So as Peter had primacy as leader of the Christian community in Rome, so Peter's successor had primacy among the bishops. And so we now begin to see this idea that the Bishop of Rome is the bishop of the bishops. So the role that a bishop has in a Christian community like Corinth: stabilization, teaching, authority, dispute resolution, pastoral care, that passes on now to the Pope, again, a derivative of this same word, Papa. So what bishops do for congregations, the Pope does for the bishops. So he is the bishop's bishop. And so he becomes known as Papa, as Father. And by the year 380, the Emperor Theodosius ordered that all believers, made an imperial proclamation that all believers would follow the teaching of the Bishop of Rome. And so if the Bishop of Rome made a statement about Christian belief, then that was now doctrine. And the Bishop of Rome at the time that Emperor Theodosius ruled was a man named Damasus I. And this is also the first time that we see a particular term, it's a Latin term, used. It had been used to talk about the emperor himself, but it now becomes a term that is used to talk about the Pope. And that term is Pontifex Maximus. And this word Pontifex comes from this image that you see here on the PowerPoint. And it is the Latin word for bridge. And that is because in the ancient world, so many bridges were built out of floating boats or pontoons. So a pontoon bridge, like you see here, is the origin of the word pontifex. And you will often hear the Pope called the pontiff. And that simply means that the Pope, even as early as 380, the Pope is seen as the bridge between the bishops that unites them together. And we begin to see this idea of the Pope acting as a bridge between the church and the divine. Now, as Protestants, this gets our hackles up, as we say here in the South, not just no, but hell no, right? We are not comfortable with somebody other than Jesus as the intercessor between God and individuals, between the divine and the secular. But organizationally, this is what begins to happen, is that as the church's bureaucracy begins to grow, it makes sense on one level for the Pope to be the Pontifex, to be the bridge. And the person who really begins to codify this, of course, is a Pope himself. This is Pope Leo I, later known as Leo the Great. And Leo was the Bishop of Rome from the year 440 to the year 461. So he was Pope, he was Bishop of Rome for 21 years. And it's Leo that really sort of lays out the theories of the leadership of the Pope. Now, again, to be fair, from our 21st century way of thinking, this is a little bit crazy, right? It reminds those of us who are old enough to remember the early 1970s when President Nixon said, if the president does it, it's not illegal, right? And so here we've got a guy who is the Pope writing the doctrine for how much power the Pope has. Nonetheless, if you take the word Peter and you turn it into an adjective, you get the word Petrine. So this is the Petrine theory of papal primacy, the idea, the theological and practical fleshing out of this idea that Peter himself did not just have moral precedence among the 12, that Peter was not just named by Jesus as the mostest bestest of the 12, but that Peter also had legal precedence among the 12, that Jesus explicitly said to Peter, you are the founder of my church. And so if the Bishop of Rome is the founder of the church, then for Leo, that precedence means that as the Bishop of Rome is succeeded by another Bishop of Rome and another Bishop of Rome, that he would have a legal inheritance of Peter's jurisdictional primacy. So as the apostles, as the 12 were named by Jesus as teachers, and Peter was the head of the apostles, and Peter then would be the greatest of these teachers, so Peter's successor, the Bishop of Rome, would be the greatest teacher. As the apostles, as the 12, and then obviously that moves down to 11, we know with Judas, and then back up to 12 with Judas's replacement. Just as the apostles had been the overseers of the early church, so the Pope now becomes the overseer of the whole church. And what this leads to now, and this is really hard to overemphasize, it's just an incredibly important point in the history of Christianity in Western Europe, is that as the Pope gains in authority, and as the Pope gains in power, and as the bureaucracy is created to grease that transaction, the bishops themselves are going to become more and more powerful. And so what begins to happen as the bishops become more and more powerful, and you have to couple this with what we talked about last week, which is the fact that the church now is recognized as a legal entity. And the church is going to be the recipient of bequests in people's wills. The church is going to be the recipient of gifts. The church is going to become the legal owner of property and goods. And so now the bishops essentially become the owners of the church. And so they hold this tremendous wealth. When I was in seminary in Lexington back in the late 80s, I took a class at St. Meinrad Seminary in Southern Indiana. And St. Meinrad Seminary had on its campus a gymnasium, and on the bottom floor of the building underneath the gymnasium was a tavern, it was a bar for the undergrad students and the seminarians. It was called the Unstable. And when you walked into the Unstable in St. Meinrad, Indiana, and you looked on the wall by the front door, there was a legal document given to them by the state of Indiana, and it was the liquor license. And the liquor license was issued to the Most Reverend Daniel Beekline, Bishop of Evansville, because he owned the entity. I mean, he was the legal holder of that liquor license. And so in the early church, in the 300s and 400s, the bishops become the physical, bureaucratic, legal, tangible representation of the church. And you know, we've all been down this road with trustees. Somebody slips and falls in the church. Who are they going to sue, right? Are they going to go after David? Are they going to go after the trustees? Are they going to go after, you know, is the church incorporated? All of these sort of legal calisthenics that we go through. Well, it's the bishops. And of course, if the bishops own it and the bishops now have authority over the clergy, that puts the clergy in a tremendous, that gives them a tremendous amount of power. And so if you look back before the Edict of Milan, there are thousands of very wealthy and very important families throughout the Roman Empire. And when they have sons, they want their sons to go into Roman imperial governance. That's the career, that's the career path for successful rich men prior to the Edict of Milan. After this, in the 300s and 400s, if you are a powerful, wealthy, landed family, the path for your male children is the church. You want your boy to become a priest. You want your boy to become a bishop. If you are part of the social elite, your ambition can reach its zenith, can find its satisfaction in the church. It was prestigious. It was socially uplifted, just like it was in our own history in the 1950s. If you were living in the United States in the 1950s and you were a middle-class white family, you wanted your son to be a doctor or a lawyer or the pastor of First Presbyterian Church. You know, those were the three elevated positions in the dominant white culture. If you're in the African-American tradition, right, preachers hold a tremendous amount of social and not just religious, but social and little p political authority. And in the ancient world, in the 300s and 400s, it is the church that replaces the imperial court. It is bishops, not civilian authorities. It is bishops who are the most important people in any given town. It is the priests who are assigned to large parishes who are the most important people in any town. And this even changes the geography, the topography of towns. So if you look at a Roman town in the year 100 or the year 200, it looks like this, right? This is actually, this is a map of a Roman village in Britain. And you can see here, you have the marketplace, you have government buildings, you have open spaces, right? You have baths. This is what the town looks like. By the early Middle Ages, right, European towns look like this. And at the center of the town is the church. It's physically and economically and spiritually the heart of the community. You're going to have a plaza, an open area, a square in front of the church. The church physically, architecturally dominates every city and town in Western Europe. And if that's not, if that's not an indicator of what's important, archaeologically, after all of us are just ground into dust 5,000 years from now, and archaeologists come into Lexington and uncover everything, they're going to discover our great temple, Rupp Arena. That's the biggest building in town. It's the building in town we've spent the most money on. It's the building in town that holds our greatest values. You go to Indianapolis, Lucas Oil Stadium. You go to Nashville, the football stadium. You go to any major American city, the most prominent physical structure is not a church, it's not a government building, it's not a music hall, it's an athletic arena of some kind. And that's what the church becomes. In every conceivable way, the church becomes the dominant economic and social entity in any given place in Europe. And this is simply, this is a causative, linkable, in my mind, effect of the papacy. You've got the powerful papacy and the powerful bureaucracy of the church and the power of the bishops and the power of the priests. These are educated, literate men who've grown up with familial stability, and that leads to these same folks having positions of power. Now, this is not a new story in humanity. Every single one of us listening who grew up in a county seat town knows that there are 7 or 8 families that run the town, always have, always will, hold positions on the school board, own the most important businesses in town, can get their driveway paved with public money, whatever they want to do, right? And this is simply what's going on in this period of time. And this is just as, if not more important than the actions of Constantine in saying that the church is now going to be a non-persecuted entity, because what we now essentially see, this is the triumph of Christianity. From this moment on, really up until the modern era, Christianity and the organizational bureaucracy of the church becomes the single stable social institution in Europe. Now, there are times when the bureaucracy of the church stumbles and struggles. And in those times, what we see is this other institution in the life of the church that also has a remarkable staying power and a remarkable ability to preserve so many of the important aspects of what it means to be Christian. So we need to back up a little bit and talk about what monasticism is. And so, again, I think some of us may have visited monasteries. Here in central Kentucky, you can go to Gethsemane, just about an hour west of here near Bardstown. You can go to St. Meinrad, a couple of hours west here in the Knobs in southern Indiana. There's a convent in Nazareth, Kentucky, also outside of Bardstown. There are monastic communities all around us that we can go and visit. This word, monasticism, comes from the word mono, or one. And I think the easiest way to think about this is to think about the fact, for all of us, hopefully, the call of the gospel, and I hope this was true for all of us, that the call of the gospel revolutionary. At whatever moment in our lives we began our journey, whether our own journey has been incremental or whether our own journey had this sort of watershed moment, we all choose to participate in the life of the church. And we all choose in one way or another to say that to live the gospel, to live out the values of the teachings of Jesus is a life-changing event. And so there were individuals in the early life of the church who had this kind of experience, this life-changing experience, and who chose to interpret that experience in a particular way. Now, one way of interpreting, the call of the gospel is to say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to change the world and make it into a better place. Another way of experiencing the call of the gospel is to say, I need to separate myself from anything that might come between me and God. And that idea of trying to separate oneself from anything that would come between the individual and God, that was seen as the source and the goal of human existence. That's what monastics, that's what people who participated in this life-changing event, that's what they wanted to do. They simply felt like they could not do anything else but to separate themselves so that they might fully experience God. Now, what we see happening at essentially the same time are two types of monasticism, and I'm going to unpack that here in just a minute. And they both start in the desert. Now, all you have to do is read the New Testament to understand how important the desert was in the New Testament period, how important the desert was in Jesus's life, how important the desert was in the writings of the in the minds of the gospel writers. Obviously, Palestine is a desert country, and this idea of the desert as a place of purification, this idea of the desert as a place where individuals can be strengthened, where individuals can be tested, where individuals can be purified, like where they can be refined in the same way that ore is refined to extract gold or silver and let the dross, the pollutants burn away. That's really what the desert can do. And what we see happen in the early 300s is the development of two kinds of monasticism. The first is attributed to an individual named Anthony. And Anthony died in the year 356. And what we know about Anthony is that he believed that if an individual could conquer the desires of the body, then an individual could unite with those things that are greater and purer and more holy. And so one had to conquer the body, the lusts of the flesh. Now, of course, again, as 21st century Americans, we think of sexual activity, but he wasn't just talking about this. He was talking about all of the things that the body needs. The body needs food. The body needs water. As human beings, we crave adventure. We crave knowledge. We crave self-improvement. We crave power. We crave ego. And by conquering all of this, by purifying one's self of all of these things. One could elevate the human spirit and become closer to God. And so at about the age of 20, Anthony went into the desert. And there he isolated himself, and he sought to pray, and he renounced all of his worldly possessions. What he really wanted to do is he wanted to imitate what he understood as the selflessness of Jesus. And he took in particular the inspiration of Jesus's self-purification for 40 days in the desert after his baptism. Now, obviously, if you go off in the desert to do this, it's one of these sort of chicken and egg arguments. People are not going to know that you're out there renouncing yourself unless they come out and see you. So in a way, Anthony sort of creates this self-defeating cult, or a self-defeating cult is created around him. I don't want to necessarily give him the responsibility for this. But this is the first kind of monasticism. It is called eremitic monasticism. And it comes from the Greek word eremos, which is the word for desert. And it's where we get our word arid, and it's where we get our word hermit. So that's what Anthony was. He was a hermit who went off to live in the desert by himself, to purify himself, to bring himself closer to God. And so any of us in our lives who have done any kind of isolation or gone on a spiritual retreat where we spend a lot of time by ourselves, we're imitating in one way or another Anthony. Now, at the same time, another individual is living in Egypt in the desert. His name is Pachomius. And he was a Roman soldier who left the military and who has been given credit for creating a second type of monasticism. And this Pachomius died in 346. So you can see here, he's a contemporary of Anthony. And Pachomius essentially, in a way, wanted to do the same thing that Anthony wanted to do. He wanted to get away from the hustle and bustle of the world. He wanted to get away from the temptations of life outside of the gospel. He wanted to experience the purification and the cleansing that the desert can give, but he didn't want to do it by himself. He wanted to do it within a self-isolating community. Now, this is not a unique idea, right? He's not the first guy to think this up. The Essenes that we talked about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, same thing, right? A community that goes out in the desert and isolates itself. All you got to do is drive 30 minutes south of where we are sitting today, and you get to Shakertown, right? A Christian community that existed in the 1830s at the same time our movement was coming to existence. It wanted to isolate itself from the rest of the world. And so Pachomius creates this kind of monasticism that comes to be known as Cenobitic monasticism. And that word, Cenobitic, is from the Greek term that means common life. And so what we see here is a Roman soldier who leaves the military, who converts to Christianity, who is baptized as an adult, and who essentially founds a community, creates a community out in the desert. And this image is the monastery that traces itself back to Pachomius. This is an isolated community of individuals who share a common life, but whose goal is in community to isolate themselves, to remove themselves from the world. They're living essentially in little veritable towns out in the desert, but they're having as little contact with the outside world as they can. And this is where we get our word monk. The folks that live there are monks, again, mono. This is where we get the word monastery. This is the word where we get the word monasticism. And if you live in a community, again, if you live in a community, just by virtue of living in a community, some kind of organizational structure has to come into place. We've all read Lord of the Flies, or unfortunately, we may have been flipping through the dial and seen, God help us all, some episode of, Big Brother 6, where they take 45 people who don't know each other and they tie their legs together and throw them in a gymnasium in central Missouri someplace and make them live together, right? If you have a group of people living together, you're going to start to sort out the rules. And that's really what Pachomius does. He's the first person to write what is known as a rule, or the rule. And that term, the rule, is a code for daily living for a monastic community. And Pachomius's rule is not terribly complicated. It just, this is how we behave with one another. This is how we share the chores, right? Any of us who've ever lived in a house with somebody who's not our family knows that you got to develop a set of rules. Who washes the dishes? Who cleans the bathroom? Who mops the floor? Who does the laundry? And you're always sorting those things out and making adjustments on them. And that's really what Pachomius does here, is he writes a little booklet that says, this is how we live together. Let me just go back and point out this one last term. If you're the head of one of these monastic communities, you come to be known as an abbot. And again, this has its roots in Greek, right? Jesus's familiar term for God was Abba, which means daddy. So if you were the head of one of these monastic communities, you would be called abbot. Now, these monastic communities were not all male. Many of these monastic communities were made up of women. And if you were the head of one of these communities, you would be an abbess. And so what we see is the development of this rule. And of course, in the 300s and 400s, monasticism had a tremendous appeal. It had an appeal in a lot of different ways. It had an appeal in a purely spiritual way. There were a lot of folks who just simply wanted to be the best person they could be. They believed deeply in Jesus and in the teachings of Jesus, and they saw the most sincere and faithful way to live out those teachings would be to live in a monastic community. Others saw it as a kind of purer form of Christian life. You could kind of escape in a way the sort of hierarchical and wealth and power of the church that I talked about earlier. If you slipped into one of these monastic communities, oftentimes they were like little islands of egalitarianism, even within a hierarchical church. Although obviously within the monastic communities there was a hierarchy as well. It wasn't nearly as stark, and as it didn't have the kind of malevolence that sometimes existed outside of the monastic communities. Obviously, if you are a woman in a society that is highly patriarchal, finding a kind of respite in one of these monastic communities was incredibly rewarding and satisfying. And I just wanted to point out one individual in particular, an Italian Benedict of Norcia, who comes along a couple of hundred years later. He died in the year 545. And Benedict built one of the most impressive monasteries in all of Italy. You see it in the lower left-hand corner of this image. It was called Monte Cassino. This is what it looks like today. This is what it looked like about 100 years ago. However, the image on the right is what it looked like in 1945. It was bombed into oblivion during World War II because the Germans had holed up on top of this mountain in this monastery. And so the Allies felt like they had no recourse but to destroy this, this seminal place in the history of Christianity. Has since obviously been rebuilt, but it bears the scars of hatred and human warfare. And so the idea of monasticism, the idea of making an explicit and conscious choice to live a life that was in opposition to the greater world, in opposition to the larger society. This is a really powerful statement. It's a powerful statement today. And you don't just simply say, hey, I'm going to become a monk. If you belong to a monastic community, and there are Protestant monastic communities as well as Catholic monastic communities, it is a multi-year commitment in which you go through a series of self-examination and examination from the outside. They just don't let anybody in. They want folks who are serious about this commitment. And certainly later on, and we'll talk about this in our last lesson, these monastic communities become incredibly important in preserving the teachings of the church, in preserving the knowledge of the church. They become the locations of libraries. They really become an incredibly important, monasticism becomes an incredibly important institution in the history of the church, simply because when European society really begins to kind of crumble, monastic communities stand out as places of stability and places where so much of the knowledge and the history of the church is perpetuated. I am going to look and pull up the chat and see what I can find here. Did Leo espouse papal infallibility? No, Leo did not. The idea of papal infallibility comes along in the 19th century. And it is one of the popes named Pius. I can't remember which number it is. And what Pius argues is that it is possible for the Pope himself to make statements that are infallible. Now, what Pius does not say is everything the Pope says is infallible. Pius does not argue that. Pius argues that there is a process by which the Pope can say ahead of time, to use Southern language, I'm fixing to say something that's really important and it's going to be infallible. And when I say it, it's said. And in fact, there have only been 2 statements that the Pope has made that are classified as these infallible statements. The term that the church uses is ex cathedra, EX-CATHEDRA, which is the Latin for from the chair. So you have the idea of the Pope literally sitting on the throne, and with all of the authority that idea comes from. Remember, in the New Testament, when they don't talk about this, but we know from lots of documentation that this is what would have happened when Jesus is brought before Pilate in the New Testament. Pilate would have stepped out into the praetorium, and one of his assistants would have taken a little wooden stool with a cloth top that sort of folds up like a camp seat. and he would have unfolded that and set it down, and Pilate would have sat on that stool, on that chair. And when Pilate did this, Pilate became the physical representation of the emperor. By sitting on that chair, he was the emperor, in the same way that when an American ambassador, when the U.S. ambassador to Argentina walks into a diplomatic meeting, that person is the physical representation of the United States of America. And so Pilate would have been the emperor. And so when the Pope sits on the chair, sits ex cathedra, and makes these statements, the Pope is speaking with all of the authority that he has. The two statements that the Pope has made are, again, two statements that Protestants get all wiggy about, right? The first of these statements is that the Virgin Mary was conceived without sin. This is the Immaculate Conception. Immaculate Conception does not refer to Jesus, it refers to Mary. And the Catholic doctrine was that Mary had to herself be without sin because she was carrying in her womb the very Son of God, and the very Son of God could not have been rolling around in a sinful womb. So Mary herself had to be conceived without sin. The second statement that the Pope makes that's infallible is that when Mary dies, she was bodily assumed into heaven in the same way that Jesus was. This is known as the Blessed Assumption. And so those are the only two statements that the Pope has said, this is it, no way, no ifs, ands, or buts. These are the two infallible statements that the Pope has made. Yes.
Bruce, two questions. One is, what does the mono, the in monasticism, what's the referent? One what? One God? One what?
I think it has to do with aloneness, singularity of the individual.
By myself.
Yeah, by myself.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And the other question I was going to ask, and maybe I'm missing, but the primacy of Peter, of course, or of Peter. Have there been any popes that named themselves Peter?
No. I think that has, I think that has just been, it's just, that's just considered too presumptuous.
Off the table. Okay.
Yeah. We've made it as far as we have now. We've got the first Francis, whereas there were actually 24 Johns. The last John was John the 23rd, but there were two of them at one time. So, and then you get these weird, Damasus and Urban and Sixtus and all these, but no, nobody chose to say, I've got the cojones to say I'm the second coming of Peter, and so that's going to be my name.
Well, it's interesting to me that biblically, if there's any contest between primacy of the disciples, John could have some claim on that, the beloved disciple. And there have been so many Johns, as you noted, but I just hadn't thought. Nobody wants to just
no, and with all due respect to Mr. Costello, there's only one Elvis, and and you're just not going to try to be a performer and call yourself Elvis unless your mama gave you that name. So, all right, so the emperor seemingly was the authority behind this papal stuff. Thus, we have the beginning of the imperial Christianity, church and state are in bed together. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, even as the power of the empire shifts east and the power of the papacy remains in the west, Ken, you just nailed it. I mean, I think once you have this relationship where Christian, and this is what a clergy colleague of mine argued 30 years ago. Once Christianity becomes palatable and common and acceptable in society, it just really loses its fire. I mean, because how many of us have to worry about being martyred for our faith? We just don't. But if you are in a situation where saying I believe in Jesus is going to result in you, somebody slashing your throat or molesting your children in front of you and your wife in front of you and then setting you on fire, and you still choose to say I believe in Jesus, I mean, that's the kind of faith, and that acts as the kind of engine that powers the church in its first 300 years. And it's just, it's just become so milk toasty everywhere. And I'm not saying that there haven't been Christians, but it's just a night and day. The faith and what it means to be a Christian just is so inexorably changed once you have this act where Christianity becomes tolerated by the empire. It's not the experience that any of the New Testament writers lived out. It's really not. And we can, particularly as disciples, we can say, well, we want to go back and create a New Testament church. But if we really want to go out and create a New Testament church, then we need to be living under fear of our lives every day. We really need to be so radical and so passionate about what we say that we alienate ourselves from the rest of society. And even today, we, irrespective of what, I don't think any of us sits around and says, boy, I wish I could be treated like we treat Jehovah's Witnesses, scorned and made fun of, and the kids don't stand up for the pledge in school, and they won't give blood, and we pick on them, and but they sure as heck believe what they say they believe, right? Monasticism, individual churches, community. Yeah, I mean, that's this thing. I would also argue that, Ken, that in so much of 21st century Western evangelical Christianity, church is individual. I mean, it's just me and God, me and Jesus. Are you saved? That's really, I think, for so many people who aren't the least bit interested in monasticism, I think Christian faith, one of the dangers that Christian faith has is that it becomes just me and Jesus. It becomes so individual. And I always love to point out when I do communion meditations at Lafayette, we have a cross on the table. And I said, that cross is a wonderful physical example because the cross connects individuals to God, but it's not a pole, it's a cross. There's these arms that reach out. And so church is community relation, but it's also the individual relationship. And I think if you are a vibrant, active member of your church, but you have no personal spirituality, you're just hollow on the inside. And if you have this remarkable, vibrant inner spirituality, but you don't have any community, you're hollow on the outside. And so, I mean, I think it's trying to find that balance. And I will give some monastics their due, particularly some of the monastic communities that do outreach. There are, like the Benedictines, they're not just green cheese. They actually go out and live in community, but then they also go out in the world and do things as well. So, you're trying to find that balance. What was the relationship between church and monasticism in the first few centuries of the empire and that relationship in the present? So, Paul, I'm going to ask you to rephrase that for me.
Sure. I'd be happy to, Bruce. The way I think of the growth of monasticism in terms of the early church, 4th, 5th, and 6th century, is that they're in kind of tension with one another.
Yeah.
Simply because many monastics saw the enculturation of the church post-Constantine as a threat to what you were talking about in terms of purity.
Yeah.
And so you have the church with authority, and you have monasticism with experiential authority.
Yeah.
And shall we say, institution building doesn't always like spontaneity.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's my take, my quick interpretation of what's going on. Those two institutions are obviously in somewhat competition with one another.
Yeah.
I don't sense that today, but I don't know enough to be able to suggest any kind of relationship
I would agree with you. I would agree with you, except I would say today, if you're a Roman Catholic, if you want to walk into a room where this tension is palpable, you go stay with nuns, because women living community have had it up to here with the nonsense of the bureaucratic church and the patriarchy of the church and the muck of the church. And so you have seen attempts, particularly by Benedict. I mean, Benedict essentially created this commission to kind of go in and try to pressure female religious into, shut up and know your place, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I think early on you are going to have this tension, and I failed to really talk about that, because just as the monastic community is a way to withdraw from the hierarchical church, the hierarchical church is not just going to say, oh, okay, y'all go on, because in addition, monasteries are going to become places of wealth and power as well. And so, if you're a European citizen, if you're a serf, if you're a farmer, if you're a peasant in Europe in the 400s and 500s and 600s, you're going to be within earshot of a monastic community. You're going to hear the bells when the monks pray the hours. You're going to stop in your field and say the prayers. You're going to know that place is sanctuary. If there's war, it's a safe place to go. If you get into political trouble, it's a safe place to go. If your feudal lord is asking for overtaxation or your service in the military, it's a safe place to go. And so you are going to see a lot of this tension, just in the same way politically as towns begin to develop. Towns become little islands of independence outside of the authority of feudal rulers, and there's all sorts of pushback there. Yes, I mean, clearly in the first 600 years, the church is going to have this kind of hostile relationship. And later on, you're going to see other quasi-monastic entities like the Jesuits come into existence. They get purged at one point because they're simply seen as having too much power. And any threat to the institution is going to be seen as having too much power, whether it's godlyly generated like monasticism, or whether it's just a kind of secular thing. So, that's, and I'm just so thankful that we as Protestants never have power struggles in our churches, but nonetheless, that's really what it's about. It's about money, it's about power, it's about authority, and certainly, yes. And to answer Hank's question, I mean, that's what the author of the book, How the Irish Saved Civilization, I mean, that's really what he believes, is that monasticism not only saved Christianity, it saved human civilization, saved Western civilization at a time when we really, as a culture, had forgotten so much of what we'd known, but that knowledge is preserved in monastic libraries and in the practice of monks. It's really fascinating. There's just, it is such a rich thing to understand. And as Paul has pointed out, it is not, the study of monasticism and the history of the church is not lots of black and white. It is so much gray, and there is so many varied ways to interpret all of these things. It is in its own way, it is just as difficult a topic to talk about as human sexuality or reproductive freedom are today. Is just really, people get their hackles up and have turf that they want to defend when you talk about something like this. So.
Very good. Very good. Any other questions this evening? Woo-wee.
This is fun. Right, you all are fun to talk to.
All right, I'm going to turn the recording off. Stop the recording.